Despite his stature as a significant figure in French poster art, Théophile Steinlen seems to have been rather obscured by the attention lavished on his contemporary Toulouse-Lautrec. He was born in Switzerland in 1859, but in his early 20s he moved to the artistic community of Montmartre in Paris. There he was befriended by the painter Adolphe Willet, who introduced him to the bohemian crowd which gathered at Le Chat Noir Cabaret. And this led to commissions for posters for the owner and star performer Aristide Bruant, which in turn led to requests for similar promotional material for other local enterprises. By the early 1890s, Steinlen's art was being exhibited at the Salon des Indépendants, and at the same time he became a regular contributor to several Parisian magazines, most notably Gil Blas and Le Mirliton. Much of his magazine illustration recorded the daily lives of Parisians in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and Steinlen didn't shy away from revealing the miserable conditions the poorer citizens lived in. And during the Great War, his emotionally charged images focused heavily on the effect it had on civilians caught up in the conflict. Throughout Steinlen's career, cats were a recurring theme, and by all accounts he was frequently to be seen feeding the feral cat population on the streets of Montmartre. He made many drawings and prints of them, and they were a regular feature of his magazine illustrations and posters. Art historians have put forward the idea that the cats were a symbolic representation of the freedom of Parisian bohemian society, and particularly the liberated females of the artistic community. But it's always possible, of course, that he just liked cats. Whatever the truth of his feline affiliations, he continued to paint and draw the animals in his parallel careers in art and commercial work, up to his death in Paris in 1923 at the age of 64. Austrian illustrator and designer Julius Klinger has featured in other videos, but it would be difficult to overstate his importance, so I think he's worth a closer look. He was born in 1876 and studied at the Technological Trade School in Vienna. And from there he went to work at the fashion magazine Wiener Mode in 1895. In 1897 he moved to Berlin, where he worked as a commercial artist and occasional book illustrator. And over the next decade his reputation grew so much that the magazine Art and Decoration devoted a whole issue to Klinger in 1908. Soon after he began creating posters for the printers Hollerbaum and Schmidt, such as this daringly modernist poster for aeroplane flights around Berlin in 1912. He was also working regularly for various magazines including Lustige Blatter, and his growing reputation also led to academic roles, including artistic director of the College of Decorative Arts. After the Great War ended in 1918, he opened a studio in Vienna, where among many other significant commissions he created an advertising campaign for the cigarette paper company Taboo. For this, Klinger designed a remarkably diverse range of stylish and occasionally comic images. Although he was responsible for establishing many principles of modern graphic design, he also understood the value of humour to get the audience's attention. And in the late 20s and early 30s, his Art Deco styling became popular in other countries, including Britain. But being Jewish, Klinger was increasingly persecuted by the Nazis as they rose to power, and throughout the 1930s they placed more and more restrictions on him until he was unable to make a living. And in 1942, he was deported to a concentration camp in Minsk, and predictably he died there soon after. Born in Armenia in 1900, Constantin Alajalov was a student at the University of Petrograd, when in 1917 the Russian Revolution put an end to his studies. He travelled to the Middle East for a few years before heading to America in 1923, After a couple of unsuccessful years there, he was asked to paint murals for a restaurant owned by an expatriate Russian countess. And through this connection in 1926 he came to the attention of the New Yorker magazine. Like others, he used the magazine as a very public gallery to promote his imaginative and amusing illustrative talent, and his close association with them enhanced his status and popularity considerably. And he became almost as popular with rival style magazine Vanity Fair, featuring on the covers of both magazines simultaneously. In the 30s and 40s, Alajalov also had success with book illustration, and his own witty visual interpretation of the songs of George Gershwin was particularly well received in 1932. A decade later, his monochromes for a humorous verse retelling of Cinderella by Alice Miller also proved popular. And by this point, the earlier Art Deco influence in his work had softened into a far more organic, spontaneous style. 20 years after his debut, this change was obvious in his continuing illustration for the New Yorker, with more impressionistic loose watercolour and sensitive gestural inking. From 1945 onward, Alajalov simultaneously created covers for the Saturday Evening Post. This was highly unusual, as both these magazines normally demanded exclusivity in their contracts. That they were prepared to share his talent is a clear indication of Alajalov's standing at the time. But all good things come to an end. His relationship with the New Yorker didn't make it past the 1950s, and Alajalov's last cover for the Post was in late 1962, at which point he seems to have disappeared from view, even though he didn't die until a quarter of a century later, in 1987. Elmer Sims Campbell wasn't the only black illustrator of his time, but he was by far the most well known. Elton Fax, Aaron Douglas and Robert Savon Pius were also getting published, but I've been unable to dig up enough decent resolution images to enable me to feature them. Campbell was born in St. Louis in 1906, and when he was 4 years old his father died. His mother took him to live in Chicago, where he later studied at the Art Institute. Following a move to New York City in 1929, he began contributing illustrations to newspapers and magazines, most significantly a series of covers for the humour magazine Judge. At that time, racial segregation was a fact of life in America, and this was reflected in the nature of Campbell's work. So most of his output, and certainly his humour, featured white characters in a largely white world. Occasionally he had the chance to illustrate black subjects, but his own ethnic identity was kept secret by the publishers, worried that racially intolerant readers would boycott their publications. In 1932, Campbell's nightclub map of Harlem proved popular enough to be reprinted by several magazines, and in the same year he also provided some radically different woodcut-styled monochromes for Sterling Brown's poem collection Southern Road. And not long after, he created similarly styled images for the Haitian children's story Popo Amphifina. Presumably it was thought that the more bigoted element of his white readership weren't likely to be reading books such as these. In 1933, the men's magazine Esquire was launched, and it featured Campbell's popular series Harem Girls from the very first issue onwards. These and his other colour illustrations were created with watercolour applied over pencil, although he occasionally used gouache for flatter areas too. His monochromes were primarily pen and ink, although closer examination suggests dry brush and even crayon for shaded effects. In 1939 he repeated the success of his Harlem map, but this time in full colour, to highlight the attractions at the New York World's Fair. He also began a single-panel joke series called Cuties, which was syndicated in more than 100 newspapers and ran successfully throughout the war and for quite a few years after. But it was his work for Esquire which remained the foundation of his success, Not only was he providing them with illustrations and cartoons, but he was also writing articles and even jokes for others to visualise. Despite the continuing segregation in the States, Esquire did at least give Campbell the opportunity to write, illustrate and joke about the lives of the black population. And he stayed with them up to 1957, which was the year he moved with his family to Switzerland. Campbell continued to provide occasional racy cartoons, mostly for Playboy, well into the 60s. But in 1970 he was diagnosed with cancer, and he returned to the States and died a year later at the age of 65. Quite a few comic strip enthusiasts know and revere Alex Raymond as the creator of Flash Gordon, but most people don't know him at all. He was born in New York in 1909, and his first job was as a mortgage broker on Wall Street. It wasn't what he wanted to do, but he used the money he made from his job to enroll at New York's Grand Central School of Art. And in the early 20s he found work as an assistant illustrator on the comic strip Tilly the Toiler by Russ Westover. He also assisted on Chick Young's massively popular Blondie strip. But Raymond was ambitious, and towards the end of 1933 he created Flash Gordon with the writer Don Moore. The strip was designed to compete with the already popular Buck Rogers strip, and before long Flash was the more popular of the two. Raymond was hitting his stride at this point, and simultaneously worked on two other strips. Jungle Jim, again with Don Moore, and the spy adventure Secret Agent X9, written by respected crime author Dashiell Hammett. But the workload proved too much for him, and he abandoned Agent X9 in 1935. Alongside his commitment to Flash Gordon, he also created other work, mostly for magazines, and these relatively rare examples of gouache tonal renders show what he was capable of when not limited to the mechanically applied, frequently out of register colour used in the printing of comic strips. If it hadn't been signed, I wouldn't have believed that this remarkably skillful wartime painting was his work. Raymond was scrupulous about all his illustration methods, whether for his strips or not, and he drew mainly from life, with photographic reference for scenic plausibility. In World War II he saw combat with the Marines fighting the Japanese, and when he returned to civilian life he found out he'd been replaced on Flash Gordon by Austin Briggs. Naturally enough, he wasn't happy about this, but the publishers offered him a new strip, and he created Private Detective Rip Kirby, for which he demanded and got a far bigger share of the profits than was usual. With Rip Kirby, his inking took on a slick modernist angular style, more in keeping with the fashion of post-war American illustration. And all was going particularly well for Alex Raymond until 1956, when the sports car he was driving spun off the road and he was killed in the crash at the age of only 47. There's been some speculation about it being suicide, but we'll never know. And that rather depressing piece of information brings us to the end of another instalment, so I hope to see you next time.